Breathe in. Hold it. That air filling your lungs right now is thin, clean, and safe. But close your eyes and imagine trading it for an atmosphere that is heavy, suffocatingly humid, and laced with a faint, bitter tang of sulfur and ancient soil. The ground beneath your feet isn't concrete or soft grass. It's a bed of coarse ferns and rotting cycad fronds, vibrating with low, rhythmic thud that rattles the marrow in your bones. You look up, but there are no familiar birds tracing lines across clouds. Instead, leathery wings eclipse the sun, casting jagged, terrifying shadows over a forest that contains no flowers, no fruits, and no mercy. Something is moving in the dense, greenhouse fog ahead. Something with a neck the size of a telephone pole and the mass of 10 elephants. It moves through the ancient mist with silent, impossible grace. And when it turns to look down from the canopy, you realize you are standing face to face with a creature your species won't even have words for until it's been dead for 150 million years. You have just stepped into the Jurassic. This was an era so vast, so unfathomably deep, that all of human history, every empire, every war, every technological revolution, from the first stone cities in Mesopotamia to the device you're using right now, fits into the last 10,000 years. The Jurassic Period lasted 56 million years. It was 5,600 times longer than the entirety of human civilization. It is an alien world buried right beneath your feet, a time of giants, monsters, and unparalleled evolutionary horror and triumph. Welcome to Earth Documentary. To truly understand how the dinosaurs conquered this planet, we must first completely erase the idea that they were always destined to rule. They weren't. If you had walked the Earth 201 million years ago, in the twilight of the late Triassic period, you would have barely noticed a dinosaur. They were the underdogs, the outcasts. The world belonged entirely to a dynasty of terrifying, heavily armored reptilian warlords known as the Pseudosuchians. These were the ancient, distant ancestors of modern crocodiles. But if you are picturing a sluggish, river-dwelling ambush predator, you are entirely mistaken. Evolution had twisted the Pseudosuchians into a nightmare variety of forms. There were species that gallop across the arid plains on long, powerful legs, hunting in packs like reptilian wolves. There were massive beaked herbivores the size of modern rhinoceroses, their bodies encased from head to tail in impenetrable, interlocking plates of bone. They were the undisputed lords of the land, an evolutionary dynasty that had perfected its iron grip on the planet over tens of millions of years. The early dinosaurs lived entirely in their shadow. They were restricted to the ecological fringes, darting through the underbrush, small, terrified, and forced to hunt insects or scavenge scraps under the cover of darkness just to avoid being slaughtered by the true masters of the world. They were waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for an opportunity that seemed biologically impossible. But planetary dynasties do not usually die from competition. They die from catastrophe. At this time, the Earth was not a map of scattered continents. It was a single, unbroken, monolithic supercontinent known as Pangaea. It stretched from pole to pole, a massive continuous landmass with vast, punishing deserts in its interior and ferocious, monsoon-battered coastlines. Deep beneath the crust of Pangaea, the Earth's mantle was boiling, a massive upwelling of superheated rock. A mantle plume of unimaginable thermal energy began to press against the underside of the landmass. The pressure built for millennia, a ticking time bomb of geological fury, until the crust of the Earth could no longer hold. Pangaea tore itself open. A fissure thousands of kilometers long unzipped across the heart of the supercontinent, violently separating what is now eastern North America from northwestern Africa. But this was not a mountain erupting. This was not a single, cone-shaped volcano blowing its top. This was the birth of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, and it was the closest the Earth has ever come to literal hell. For roughly 600,000 years, the Earth bled. Millions of cubic kilometers of liquid basalt poured from the ground in use of eruptions. There were no massive explosions, just endless, unstoppable rivers of molten rock that flooded the landscape, creating seas of fire that would have buried the entire continental United States under a suffocating blanket of solid stone more than 200 meters thick. But the lava, as terrifying as it was only the local executioner. The true killer was invisible, it was airborne, and it spread across the globe with ruthless efficiency. As the magma boiled to surface, it incinerated massive subterranean deposits of carbon and sulfur, vomiting an estimated 100,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. To put that catastrophic number into perspective, humanity has released roughly 2,000 gigatons of carbon since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and that has been enough to fundamentally alter our climate. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province released 50 times that amount in a geological blink of an eye. The sky turned toxic. A runaway greenhouse effect slammed into the planet. Global temperatures violently spiked by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. The tropical regions of the world literally baked, transforming into dead zones where the heat exceeded the physiological limits of complex life. Proteins began to denature, plants withered into ash. But the atmosphere was playing a cruel psychological game. The volcanic fissures were not just releasing carbon dioxide. They were spewing millions of tons of sulfur dioxide. When this sulfur hit the upper atmosphere, it combined with water vapor to create a highly reflective haze of microscopic sulfate aerosols. These particles acted like a planetary mirror, blocking out the sun. So, while the immense blanket of carbon dioxide was trying to boil the planet, the sulfur dioxide triggered brutal, sudden volcanic winters. The sun was dimmed to a pale, sickly disk. Temperatures would plummet, freezing tropical flora and fauna, plunging the world into darkness and ice for years or decades. But sulfur aerosols are heavy. Eventually, they washed out of the sky in the form of highly toxic, highly corrosive acid rain. And the moment the sulfur was gone, the trapping heat of the carbon dioxide brutally reasserted itself. Ecosystems were whipped back and forth between freezing darkness and suffocating heat. It was a climatic whiplash that no large, specialized organism could endure. The oceans fared no better. The massive influx of atmospheric carbon dissolved into the seawater, creating carbonic acid. The pH of the global ocean plummeted in a horrifying wave of ocean acidification. For millions of years, magnificent coral reefs had housed a bizarre and thriving community of marine reptiles, coiled ammonites, and ancient fish. In the acidified waters, the reefs literally dissolved. The very building blocks of marine life, calcium carbonate, became impossible to synthesize. Animals with shells melted alive in the corrosive water. The complex marine food webs collapsed from the bottom up, and riding on the acidic rain, settling into the soils and the dying seas, was a final, silent killer, pure toxic mercury, released in gaseous form from the deep earth. It poisoned whatever animals were desperately trying to cling to life, bioaccumulating the food chain until it reached lethal toxicity. When the earth finally stopped tearing itself apart, when the fissures cooled to black, smoking scars, the silence that fell over the planet was deafening. Approximately 76% of all species on Earth had been erased. The mighty Pseudosuchians, the undisputed, heavily armored kings of the Triassic, were gone. Their massive, perfectly adapted bodies had been their ultimate undoing. They required too much food to sustain their immense bulk. Their reproductive cycles were too slow to bounce back from population crashes. They simply could not survive the violent pendulum of fire and ice, the acid rain, and the total collapse of the food chain. They starved in the dark and suffocated in the heat. Their empire was reduced to fossilized bone and ash. But as the toxic clouds slowly began to part, as the sun touched the ruined surface of a devastated world, something moved in the ashes. The dinosaurs had survived. They did not survive because they were superior or stronger or smarter than the giants that had perished. They survived by a stroke of blind, evolutionary luck. They possessed traits that, while useless for dominating the Triassic, were a perfect toolkit for surviving an apocalypse. First, they were small. The majority of dinosaurs alive during the extinction event were roughly the size of modern dogs or ostriches. Small animals need far less food, a critical advantage when the global food web collapses. Second, many of these early dinosaurs were capable of burrowing. While the Pseudosuchians froze on the surface or baked in the blistering heat waves, the small dinosaurs dug deep into the earth, finding subterranean refuges where the temperature fluctuations were dampened and the acid rain could not reach them. Third, and perhaps most crucially, many of these early dinosaurs were warm-blooded and covered in primitive, downy feathers. These were not the complex, aerodynamic feathers of modern birds, but simple, hair-like filaments designed for one purpose: insulation. When the volcanic winters plunged the world into freezing darkness, the dinosaurs huddled in their burrows, their feathered coats trapping their body heat, keeping their high metabolisms running, while the cold-blooded reptiles on the surface froze to death. And they were not alone in the dark. Creeping out from the deepest crevices, twitching their whiskers in the silent, ruined world, were the earliest mammals, tiny, shrew-like creatures that had spent tens of millions of years hiding from the pseudosuchians. They, too, were warm-blooded. They, too, were insulated by fur, and their nocturnal lifestyles had gifted them with incredibly advanced senses of smell and hearing, allowing them to navigate and hunt insects in a world that was temporarily plunged into darkness. They had watched the giants die, and they, alongside the dinosaurs, had inherited the ashes. This is the dawn of the early Jurassic. The global stage was entirely empty. The ecological thrones, carefully carved out and fiercely guarded over tens of millions of years, were suddenly vacant. The air was slowly stabilizing. The carbon cycle was settling into a new rhythm, and the planet was entering a permanent, humid greenhouse state. There were no ice caps at the poles. The world was warming into a wet, lush paradise, and for the first time in their history, the dinosaurs looked around and realized there was absolutely nothing left to stop them. The first few million years of the early Jurassic were a time of planetary healing. The Earth experienced a lingering hangover from the extinction, a period scientists call the early Jurassic cool interval. Global temperatures remained slightly suppressed, the weather patterns erratic as the atmosphere digested the last of the volcanic gases. The great, towering gymnosperm forests of the Triassic had been burned away or poisoned, replaced by hardy, opportunistic plants. Ferns spread like a dense, green carpet over the volcanic ash, their spores carrying on a wind to colonize the empty, scarred continents. But as the millions of years ticked by, the climate settled. Pangaea was irrevocably broken. The rift that had torn the Americas away from Europe and Africa was now filling with seawater, creating a narrow, shallow, sun-drenched seaway that would eventually widen into the Atlantic Ocean. Sea levels began to rise, flooding the low-lying continental margins, creating vast, warm, epicontinental seas that were nutrient-rich and perfect for the explosive recovery of marine life. On land, the evolution that followed the extinction was a runaway train of biological experimentation. The world was a blank canvas, and the survivors began to radiate outward, mutating, adapting, and growing to fill every conceivable ecological void. The bipedal meat eaters, the theropods, were the first to truly capitalize on the silence. Without the massive, wolf-like pseudosuchians to hunt them or outcompete them, they began to grow. Dilophosaurus stepped out of the shadows of the recovering conifer forests. Forget the fictionalized, venom-spitting, frill-flaring creature of Hollywood. The real Dilophosaurus was far more impressive and far more terrifying. Reaching over 6 meters in length and weighing nearly half a ton, it was the first true apex predator of the New World. It was a creature of sharp, lethal geometry, balancing perfectly on 2 powerful hind legs, its long tail acting as a counterweight. Running along its snout were twin, delicate bony crests, likely wrapped in brightly colored keratin, used not for combat, but as vivid display structures to intimidate rivals and attract mates in the dappled light of the early Jurassic canopy. Its jaws were a masterpiece of early predatory design. They were lined with long, deeply rooted, serrated teeth, perfect for snapping up smaller dinosaurs, armored insects, and the tiny, scurrying ancestors of mammals. Dilophosaurus was a ghost moving through the trees, an experiment in bipedal locomotion and carnivorous efficiency that would lay the genetic and biomechanical groundwork for every great meat-eater to come. But while the predators were refining their weapons, the most profound, earth-shattering transformation was happening among the plant-eaters. The vegetation of the early Jurassic was growing thicker, tougher, and higher. Gymnosperms, plants without flowers or enclosed fruits, were reclaiming the continents. Giant conifers, stretching toward the sunlight, created a layered, dense canopy. Beneath them, cycads with their sharp, palm-like fronds and thick trunks dominated the understory. Ginkgo trees, which survive today as a single species carefully preserved by humans, were wildly diverse, carping the forest floor with fan-shaped leaves. This vegetation was incredibly fibrous. It was packed with tough structural compounds like lignin, and it was notoriously difficult to digest. To extract enough calories from this recalcitrant plant matter, an herbivore needed to hold the food in its gut for a very long time, allowing vast colonies of bacteria to ferment and break down the cellulose. And to house a massive fermentation chamber, you need a massive body. The evolutionary pressure was absolute: grow or starve. The herbivorous dinosaurs of the Triassic had been relatively modest, bipedal creatures. But now, as the canopy rose and the plants grew tougher, these animals, known as the prosauropods, began to change. They started dropping down onto all four legs. Their lightweight, running limbs began to thicken into dense, weight-bearing pillars of solid bone. Their center of gravity shifted forward to accommodate their expanding, barrel-shaped stomachs, and their necks began to stretch. At first, it was just a slight elongation, allowing them to crop vegetation a little higher than their competitors. But evolution rewards efficiency, and a long neck is the ultimate energy-saving adaptation. If an animal can stand perfectly still, anchoring its heavy body in one place, while its head sweeps through the vegetation in a massive three-dimensional arc, it can consume hundreds of kilograms of food without burning the calories required to walk. These were the transitional forms, the bridge between the small runners of the past and the earth-shaking titans of the future. Animals like Volcanodon began stepping heavily onto the evolutionary stage in the early Jurassic. They were not yet the colossal, building-sized monsters that would define the public image of the dinosaur, but they were the indisputable blueprint. They were 10 to 15 meters long, their heavy footfalls crushing the ferns, their elongated necks plunging into the lower branches of the conifers. They were discovering a biological loophole that would define the entire Mesozoic era. Gigantism is the ultimate defense mechanism. If you grow large enough, if your bulk simply eclipses the mechanical limits of a predator's jaws and claws, you become immune to being hunted. You transcend the food chain. You become a walking fortress. As these early sauropods pushed their way through the damp, green landscapes, their very existence demanded new biological innovations. Their hearts had to enlarge to pump blood at higher pressures. Their bones began to hollow out, forming internal air pockets to reduce their massive weight without sacrificing structural strength. They were no longer just surviving the environment. They were beginning to actively reshape it, clearing paths through the forest, their massive appetites altering the distribution of plant life across the continents. And while the land was giving birth to giants, the water was calling back its own children. The shallow, warm epicontinental seas that had flooded the margins of the broken Pangaea were teeming with recovering life. Ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that had been decimated by the acidic oceans of extinction, were radiating rapidly into thousands of new, spiraling forms. Vast schools of ancient fish navigated the sunlit waters, and chasing them, perfectly adapted to the aquatic realm, were reptiles that had abandoned the land entirely. The ichthyosaurs, the fish lizards, had barely survived the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, but in the empty oceans of the early Jurassic, they exploded in diversity and form. They pushed the limits of convergent evolution to absolute extremes, their reptilian bodies streamlining into perfect, frictionless torpedoes that mimicked the dolphins and sharks of a future they would never see. Some ichthyosaurs grew to the size of modern killer whales, the undisputed apex predators of the early seas. Others remained small and agile, their elongated, beak-like snouts filled with conical teeth, perfectly designed for snapping slippery squid out of the water column. They had become so thoroughly adapted to the marine environment that they had lost the ability to return to land to lay eggs. Instead, they gave birth to live young, their babies emerging tail first into the warm Jurassic waters, instantly capable of swimming to the surface for their first breath of air. And testing the waters alongside the sleek ichthyosaurs was an entirely different, highly bizarre experiment in marine engineering. The first plesiosaurs were appearing. They were chimeras of evolution. They possessed broad, flattened, turtle-like bodies but lacked a shell. Instead of a tail for propulsion, they relied on four massive wing-like flippers, flying through the water with synchronized, powerful strokes. And extending from their rigid bodies were long, highly flexible necks. They haunted the coastal shelves, using their long necks to strike like aquatic snakes, their heads darting into crevices and schools of fish before the prey even registered the presence of the predator's bulky body. The early Jurassic was a time of boundless, unrestrained biological ambition. The trauma of the extinction had been entirely paved over by the relentless, driving force of evolution. The empty world was full again. The ecosystems had stabilized. The global climate was a lush, vibrant hothouse. The early experiments in size, power, and specialized hunting had proven spectacularly successful. The dinosaurs on land and the marine reptiles in the sea had tasted absolute freedom, and they were thriving. They had conquered the ruins of the old world. But they were not finished. The boundaries of biology, physics, and sheer, terrifying scale were about to be pushed further than life has ever dared to go since. The warm-up was over. The foundations had been laid. The age of recovery was transitioning into the age of absolute supremacy, and the creatures that were about to walk the earth would shake the very bedrock of the continents they ruled. Imagine standing perfectly still in the humid, suffocating heat of the Middle Jurassic. You are not looking at an animal. You are looking at a living, breathing mountain of flesh. The sheer scale of the creature before you seems to violate every known law of physics. It weighs as much as 15 African elephants. It stands as tall as a 4-story building. Its tail sweeps the forest floor a full basketball court's length away from its snout. Every time it takes a step, a localized earthquake ripples through the soil, vibrating up to the soles of your feet and rattling your teeth. Every time it exhales, a massive plume of humid, fermented breath mists the canopy. You are watching a sauropod. You are witnessing the absolute pinnacle of terrestrial gigantism. For over a century, paleontologists stood in museums, staring up at the fossilized skeletons of giants like Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, and Apatosaurus, and asked one deceptively simple question: how is this biologically possible? On land, gravity is a relentless, crushing tyrant. Every single kilogram of body mass has to be supported by bone, powered by muscle, and nourished by a heart that must somehow pump thick, heavy blood up a neck stretching toward the sky like an organic crane. The metabolic cost of just standing up should be astronomical. Even the largest land mammal to ever exist, giant, extinct rhinoceros relatives that stood 5 meters at the shoulder, look like mere children's toys next to a fully grown late Jurassic sauropod. The answer to their impossible size isn't a single evolutionary trick. It is a perfect storm of biological loopholes, a masterpiece of natural engineering. It starts, invisibly, with the air they breathed. If a mammal, even a highly adapted one, miraculously grew to the size of a sauropod, it would almost instantly suffocate under its own mass. Mammalian lungs are incredibly inefficient. They inflate and deflate like balloons, meaning that with every single breath, a pocket of stale, depleted air remains trapped inside the lungs. We have to work hard to extract oxygen. But sauropods did not breathe like mammals. They possess an incredibly advanced avian respiratory system, a biological marvel inherited from their earliest dinosaur ancestors and shared only with modern birds. Instead of simple, balloon-like lungs, sauropods had rigid lungs connected to a complex, sprawling network of air sacs that extended throughout their entire bodies. When a sauropod inhaled, fresh air flowed directly through the lungs. When it exhaled, fresh air that had been temporarily stored in the air sacs flowed through the lungs again. It was a one-way, continuous loop of highly oxygenated air. This meant that a 50-ton titan could extract maximum life-giving oxygen from every single breath, whether breathing in or breathing out, fueling a massive metabolism with effortless efficiency. But these air sacs did something even more crucial, something that fundamentally unlocked the gateway to gigantism. They invaded the skeleton. The bones of these giants were highly pneumatic. They were riddled with hollow chambers, deep cavities, and internal honeycombs filled entirely with air. If you were to take a saw and slice open a cervical vertebra from the neck of a Brachiosaurus, a single bone the size of a kitchen dining table, you would find that the vast majority of it was simply empty space. The bone that remained was arranged in brilliant, stress-bearing struts and columns, identical to the exact engineering principles used by modern architects to build lightweight aluminum aircraft frames and suspension bridges. This meant that a 50-ton sauropod was not hauling around a 10-ton skeleton. Its internal framework was incredibly light, slashing its overall body weight by half, while sacrificing absolutely zero structural strength. Then there is the neck, the defining, unmistakable feature of the sauropod. In some species, this impossible structure stretched 8, 9, or even 10 meters from the heavy shoulders to the base of the tiny skull. A neck this long is a tremendous energetic advantage, a brilliant evolutionary hack for an animal that burns thousands of calories just by walking. It allows the sauropod to stand perfectly still, anchoring its massive, heavy bulk in one place, while its head sweeps to the canopy in a massive, three-dimensional arc. It could clear out hundreds of kilograms of foliage, pivoting its head through the trees without taking a single energy-wasting step. But holding that neck up required staggering biomechanics. The farther the head is from the center of mass, the more terrifying a leverage it exerts. Gravity wants to pull that head straight down into the mud. To counteract this, the vertebrae of the neck were heavily sculpted with elaborate flanges, deep grooves, and tall neural spines. These served as massive attachment points for a biological suspension bridge of thick, cable-like ligaments and corded muscles. Some sauropods, like the towering Brachiosaurus, had longer front legs and hind legs, angling their bodies upward like colossal giraffes, driving their heads deep into crowns of the highest conifers where no other animal could reach. Others, like the impossibly long, whip-tailed Diplodocus, held their bodies horizontally, using their tails as a cantilever counterweight, sweeping their heads low over the ground to vacuum up vast, endless fields of low-growing ferns. Yet, acquiring all this food presented a completely new, life-threatening problem. How do you actually digest hundreds of kilograms of tough, fibrous vegetation every single day? The sauropods found an ingenious, energy-saving solution that defies mammalian logic. They simply refuse to chew. Chewing takes time. A modern African elephant, which is a fraction of the size of a sauropod, must spend up to 16 hours a day meticulously grinding its food just to survive. A sauropod could not afford to waste 16 hours chewing. It would starve to death with a mouth full of leaves. Instead, their teeth were not flat, complex grinders. They were simple, rake-like pegs or spatulas designed solely for one purpose: to strip leaves off branches as quickly and violently as possible. Food went from the tree to the mouth and directly down the long throat in massive, unchewed, whole boluses. The real, grinding work happened deep in the pitch-black furnace of the stomach. These animals swallowed rocks. Known as gastroliths, these stones tumbled around inside their massive, heavily muscled gizzards, mechanically pulverizing and crushing the plant matter just as teeth would. From the gizzard, the pulverized food entered a vast, cavernous fermentation chamber in the gut. Here, armies of specialized bacteria broke down the tough, unyielding cellulose over a slow digestion process that lasted weeks. Because they completely skipped the act of chewing, sauropods could feed constantly, rapidly, and endlessly, stripping forests bare with terrifying machine-like efficiency. Their teeth wore down so violently from this relentless raking against hard branches that some species, like the bizarre, wide-mouthed Nigersaurus, replaced every single tooth in its skull every 14 days, cycling through thousands of teeth in a lifetime. This was a life of pure, unadulterated consumption. It was a numbers game. Once a sauropod survived the perilous, vulnerable decades of its youth and finally reached its adult proportions, it achieved a state of near biological invulnerability. Its sheer bulk was its armor. There was no predator on Earth capable of bringing down a healthy, 70-ton adult. It was a walking fortress, the undisputed master of a world tailored perfectly to sustain its endless hunger. But what did this world actually look like? If you were to wander away from the herd and step deep into a middle Jurassic forest, the physical architecture of the landscape would feel deeply, eerily familiar. You would recognize the tall canopy overhead, the shaded, humid understory, and the damp, shadowed forest floor. But the details would be entirely, chillingly alien, because in the Jurassic, the concept of flower did not exist. There were no wide, rolling blades of grass forming endless prairies. Grass would not evolve for tens of millions of years. There were no oak trees or maples dropping colorful autumn leaves. There were no sweet fruits, no blooming petals, no vibrant splashes of red, blue, or yellow to break up the endless, monotonous ocean of green and brown. The angiosperms, the flowering plants that make up nearly all the plant life you interact with today, were entirely absent. This was the absolute, unchallenged dominion of the gymnosperms, the naked sea plants. Towering conifers, ancient relatives of modern pines, redwoods, and monkey-puzzle trees, formed a high, dense canopy. Their needle-like leaves were adapted to retain water, their thick bark resistant to the massive, browsing mouths of the dinosaurs. Below them grew the cycads. These were bizarre, stout plants that looked superficially like thick, rugged palm trees, but were entirely unrelated. Their trunks were deeply scarred with diamond-shaped patterns where old, razor-sharp fronds had died and fallen away. Ginkgo trees were wildly diverse and widespread, carpeting the forest floor with their distinctive, fan-shaped leaves in seasonal rhythms. And the ground itself was choked in a dense, tangled, humid mat of giant ferns and primitive, jointed horsetails, thriving in the waterlogged soils along the riverbanks. Because there were no flowers, the soundscape of the Jurassic forest was missing something fundamental to your experience of nature. There was no buzzing of bees. There were no butterflies dancing on the breeze. The intricate co-evolutionary dance between flowering plants and sweet-drinking pollinators had not yet been invented. The insects of the Jurassic were hard-shell beetles, giant, predatory dragonflies, and primitive flies that fed on decaying organic matter or chewed directly through the tough, resinous gymnosperm leaves. Pollination in this world was not a cooperative, delicate exchange. It was an act of brute, overwhelming force. The conifers and cycads relied entirely on the wind. They released astronomical, suffocating clouds of yellow pollen into the humid air, blanking the forest floor, hoping against all odds that a few microscopic grains would ride the air currents and find their mark. It was an energetically expensive, messy, and highly inefficient way to reproduce, but it worked. It worked so incredibly well that these forests pulled limitless carbon dioxide from the hothouse atmosphere, growing at explosive rates. They laid down so much dead organic matter, burying themselves in massive, oxygen-starved peat swamps, that hundreds of millions of years later, these Jurassic forests would become the very coal seams that fuel human industry. This endless, sprawling buffet of tough, fibrous vegetation fueled the sauropod herds. But biology dictates a ruthless law. Where there is an abundance of prey, evolution will inevitably carve out a predator. And in the late Jurassic, the undisputed butcher of the landscape, the apex killer of the Golden Age, was a bipedal nightmare of precision engineering. Enter Allosaurus. While the sauropods were defined by their immense, blunt, immovable bulk, Allosaurus was a creature of sharp, lethal, hyperkinetic geometry. It was not the largest meat-eater to ever walk the earth. That title would eventually be claimed by the sailback Spinosaurs and the bone-crushing Tyrannosaurs of the later Cretaceous period. But for its time and its place, Allosaurus was the perfect killing machine, measuring up to 10 meters from its snarling snout to the tip of its stiffened tail, and weighing roughly 2 tons. It had the mass of a modern white rhinoceros, but it was balanced perfectly on 2 massive, heavily muscled hind legs, built for explosive bursts of speed. Its skull was a masterpiece of biological weight reduction. It was heavily fenestrated, riddled with large openings that kept the massive head incredibly light, without sacrificing the structural integrity needed to withstand violent, bone-jarring impacts. Its jaws could gape to a terrifying 90-degree angle, lined with dozens of serrated, backward-curving teeth shaped exactly like steak knives. But Allosaurus did not hunt like a Tyrannosaurus rex. It lacked a massive, widened skull and the staggering, bone-crushing bite force of the later tyrants. It couldn't simply bite down and shatter a femur. Instead, paleontologists believe Allosaurus may have used a radically different, far more gruesome method of dispatching its prey, a theory known as a hatchet jaw hypothesis. Rather than biting down and holding on, an Allosaurus may have opened its jaws incredibly wide, using its powerful, heavily muscled neck to slam its upper jaw downward, driving its teeth deep into the flesh of its prey like a biological battle axe. It would strike with the momentum of its entire upper body, rip away massive chunks of meat, and step back quickly, avoiding the thrashing limbs of its victim. It would inflict massive, gaping wounds, letting the prey rapidly bleed out and succumb to catastrophic shock. And if its jaws weren't enough, its arms were devastatingly functional. Unlike the vestigial, 2-fingered arms of a T-Rex, Allosaurus possessed highly muscular forelimbs equipped with 3 massive, eagle-like, recurved talons. These were grappling hooks, used to latch onto the thick hides of struggling prey, pinning them down or holding them close while the hatchet jaw went to work. The fossil record proves that this strategy was astonishingly successful. In the legendary Morrison Formation of Western North America, their bones are found in numbers that defy logic for an apex predator. At the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry in Utah, the tangled, disarticulated remains of at least 46 individual Allosaurus have been pulled from a single, highly concentrated pocket of rock. Why did so many apex predators die in one place? The mud tells a story of a terrifying predator trap. During the brutal dry seasons of the Jurassic, water became scarce. A giant herbivore, weakened by starvation, old age, or disease, likely ventured too far into the thick, sucking mud of a shrinking watering hole and became hopelessly trapped. Its panic bellows, echoing across the dry plains, serve as an irresistible dinner bell for every hungry predator within miles. An Allosaurus would charge in, eyes locked on an easy meal, only become trapped in the exact same inescapable mud. Then another would arrive, driven by the scent of blood, and another. It was a compounding, agonizing tragedy of starvation and exhaustion, a chaotic mass of thrashing, dying giants, predators, and prey alike, sinking into the earth, snapping at each other in their final moments until the rains finally returned to bury their bones under layers of fresh, indifferent sediment. Yet, Allosaurus did not rule the shadows alone. The late Jurassic supported a highly diverse guild of predators, each occupying a slightly different ecological niche to avoid direct, fatal competition with one another. Sharing the environment was Ceratosaurus. It was slightly smaller than Allosaurus, but built like a heavily armored brawler. It bore a wicked, prominent horn on its snout and two small ridges over its eyes. These bony ornaments were likely too fragile for actual combat, and were almost certainly wrapped in bright, colorful keratin, used as vivid display structures to intimidate rivals or signal to mates across the dense underbrush. Ceratosaurus was stocky, its back lined with small bony plates called osteoderms, and its flexible body suggests it may have haunted the dense, swampy waterways, ambushing prey in the thick mud where the lighter Allosaurus dared not tread. And then there was Torvosaurus, the heavy bruiser of the ecosystem, nearing the length of an Allosaurus, but built with far more muscular density and a heavier, deeper skull. It was a predator of pure brute force. It possessed the largest teeth of any Jurassic carnivore, designed to take down the most stubborn, heavily armored prey on the continent. And in the Jurassic, armor was a highly effective, deeply necessary evolutionary strategy, because not every herbivore could rely on the sheer, mountain-like size of a sauropod to protect it. Some were too small to outgrow the predators. They had to stand their ground. They had to fight. Picture the iconic, unmistakable silhouette of Stegosaurus. It is a creature so strange it feels mythological, yet its bones are very real. It possessed a massive barrel-shaped body slung low to the ground, carried on four stout, pillar-like legs. Its hind limbs were significantly longer than its front limbs, forcing its tiny head to graze perpetually near the dirt, perfectly adapted for cropping low-growing ferns. But it is the architecture of its back that draws the eye and defines its survival. Two alternating rows of massive, kite-shaped plates rose from its spine, running from the base of its neck down to its tail. And at the end of that muscular, highly flexible tail sat the ultimate biological deterrent. For wicked meter-long spikes of solid bone, paleontologists affectionately call this cluster of spikes the Thagomizer, a bizarre name born from an old comic strip that science officially adopted. But its function was entirely serious and incredibly violent. The Thagomizer was not for display. It was a weapon of pure, unadulterated defense. When threatened by the sudden, rushing charge of an Allosaurus, a Stegosaurus would pivot, keeping it heavily plated back toward the predator, looking over its shoulder. It would then blind swing its tail with devastating muscular torque. We know this weapon was highly effective because the evidence is literally written in the bones of the predators. Paleontologists have unearthed an Allosaurus vertebra with a massive puncture wound driven straight through the thickest part of the bone, a wound that perfectly matches the exact size, shape, and angle of a Stegosaurus tail spike. The Allosaurus survived the strike, the bone showing signs of healing, but the sheer agony of having a meter of solid bone driven through its spine, paralyzing surrounding muscles, must have been a brutal, unforgettable lesson in the dangers of hunting armored prey. The massive plates along its back, however, have sparked decades of intense scientific argument. Originally, they were assumed to be armor, but close inspection reveals they were deeply flawed as a shield. They were too thin, too fragile, and left the animal's flanks completely exposed. A predator approaching from the side wouldn't even be hindered by them. Furthermore, fossils show that these plates were heavily vascularized, riddled with vast, complex network of blood vessels. Today, science leans toward a brilliant dual purpose. They were highly effective thermal radiators. In the baking, stifling heat of the Jurassic midday sun, a Stegosaurus could pump its hot blood up into the plates. The breeze would catch the broad surfaces, rapidly cooling the blood before it circulated back into the animal's massive core, preventing heat stroke. In the cool mornings, they acted as living solar panels, absorbing the sun's radiation to jumpstart the giant reptile's metabolism. But those same blood vessels served another, more spectacular, and deeply intimidating purpose. By suddenly flooding the plates with a massive rush of blood, a Stegosaurus could flush them with vivid, pulsing color. It was a massive biological billboard, a sudden explosion of red or orange used to terrify approaching predators, challenge encroaching rivals, or signal to potential mates across the open fern prairies. There is a persistent, enduring myth that Stegosaurus was incredibly stupid, possessing a brain the size of a walnut and requiring a second brain in its hips just to coordinate the back half of its body. This is a dramatic, insulting fiction. Yes, its brain was small relative to its multi-ton body, smaller than a modern dog's, but it was perfectly adequate for being a Stegosaurus. It didn't need to perform complex calculus or contemplate the stars. It needed to eat ferns, breed, and violently maim anything that tried to kill it. The supposed second brain was simply a slight enlargement of the spinal cord in the sacral region, a biological relay station to handle fast reflexes and coordinate the swinging of its lethal tail. Stegosaurus was not a slow-witted evolutionary failure. It was a highly successful, specialized browser that held its own for millions of years in a world overflowing with apex predators. But armor and sheer size were not the only ways to survive the meat-eaters. While the Stegosaurs stood their ground, and the sauropods outgrew danger entirely, another lineage of dinosaurs chose a third, entirely different path. They chose speed, hypervigilance, and the impenetrable safety of the herd. These were the ornithopods, the bird-footed dinosaurs. Animals like Camptosaurus and the smaller, swifter Dryosaurus represented the nimble, highly active middle class of the Jurassic food web. Camptosaurus, weighing roughly half a ton, was a bipedal herbivore that could easily drop to all fours to forage in the low brush. It completely lacked the terrifying, bone-breaking weaponry of Stegosaurus, but possessed an evolutionary innovation that would eventually change the world: a sophisticated, keratinous beak and primitive grinding teeth in the back of its jaw. While the massive sauropods swallowed their food whole, the ornithopods were taking the very first evolutionary steps toward complex chewing. They could crop tough vegetation with their beaks and process it in their mouths, extracting far more nutrition from much smaller amounts of food. This efficiency allowed them to reproduce quickly and gather in staggering numbers. They lived in massive, dynamic herds. Fossil trackways showed dozens, sometimes hundreds of individuals moving together, mixing fully grown adults with vulnerable juveniles. This social structure was their primary and most effective defense mechanism. A solitary Camptosaurus is an easy, isolated meal for a hungry Torvosaurus. A herd of 50 is a wall of 100 eyes, 100 ears, and 50 highly sensitive noses. The moment one individual, scanning the tree line, spotted the crouching, calculating form of an Allosaurus in the ferns, a piercing alarm call would shatter the air. The entire herd would instantly erupt into explosive, synchronized motion. This flight strategy relies on sensory overload. A predator charging into a fleeing herd finds its vision blocked, its target obscured by a confusing, chaotic mass of rapidly moving bodies, making it incredibly difficult to single out, track, and run down a specific victim without being trampled or exhausted in the pursuit. This was the rhythm of the late Jurassic landscape. It was a delicate, brutal, and brilliantly balanced ecological dance. The sun beat down on the towering conifer canopies. The heavy air hummed with the sound of giant insects and the distant, echoing, chest-rattling bellows of the sauropod herds. In the shadows, The Allosaurus waited, calculating the deadly geometry of the ambush. In the open fern plains, the Stegosaurus flashed blood into its plates, swinging its spiked tail in a slow, warning arc. Every niche, every single calorie of sunlight, was exploited by a breathtaking array of specialized, highly evolved life forms locked in a permanent evolutionary arms race. The land was full. The terrestrial empire had reached a stunning plateau of gigantism and specialization. But evolution does not stop. It is a relentless, driving pressure that forces life to look toward the margins, toward the unbroken frontiers where the rules of survival are completely rewritten. As the dinosaurs achieved absolute, unshakable supremacy over the continents, life began to turn its gaze away from the mud and the ferns. It looked out toward the crushing, abyssal black of the global ocean and up toward the limitless, terrifying blue of the open sky, where gravity acts differently, where there is absolutely nowhere to hide, and where the monsters that are waiting in the dark are unlike anything the Earth has ever produced. To leave the solid, reliable shores of Pangaea and slip beneath the surface of the Jurassic Sea is to enter a realm of absolute, three-dimensional peril. The transition from walking on land to thriving in the open ocean is one of the most punishing, unforgiving biological shifts a lineage can ever attempt. The water does not care about your terrestrial adaptations. To survive here, you must completely conquer neutral buoyancy. You must redesign your limbs to push against a dense, unyielding medium. You must figure out how to insulate your core temperature against the heat-sapping depths. And you must somehow find a way to reproduce without ever returning to solid ground. But the marine reptiles of the Jurassic hadn't just solved these problems. They had weaponized them. The global ocean was completely ruled by three distinct, terrifying dynasties of predators, and the fastest, most specialized of them all were the ichthyosaurs. If you were to glimpse an ichthyosaur cutting through the sunlit shallows, your brain would instinctively tell you that you were looking at a dolphin. But this is the ultimate illusion of convergent evolution. These were cold-blooded reptiles by ancestry, their terrestrial bodies stretched smooth and streamlined over millions of years into perfect, frictionless torpedoes. But while modern dolphins are highly social, communicative mammals, the ichthyosaurs were silent, precision-engineered hunting machines. As the Jurassic progressed, some ichthyosaur lineages pushed themselves away from the safe, sunlit coastal shelves and plunged into the most hostile environment on the planet, the abyssal depths. Animals like Ophthalmosaurus evolved eyes that stagger the imagination. They possessed massive, reinforced orbs the size of dinner plates housed in narrow skulls less than a meter long. In fact, they possessed the largest eyes of any vertebrate to ever live in the history of the Earth. These massive, specialized lenses were designed to drag in the absolute faintest, most microscopic particles of light, allowing them to dive deep into the crushing, pitch-black water column. Down there, in the freezing dark, they hunted the faint, ghostly glow of bioluminescent squid and ancient deep-sea fish. And because they were so completely severed from the land, because their bodies would have collapsed under their own weight, if they ever washed ashore, they couldn't lay eggs. The fossil record preserved a breathtaking, intimate secret of their survival. Female ichthyosaurs frozen in the exact moment of giving birth. Their young emerged tail first into the water, just like modern whales, ensuring that the baby wouldn't drown during the birthing process, allowing it to instantly kick its tail and shoot to the surface for its first, desperate breath of air. But if the ichthyosaurs were the torpedoes of the Jurassic Seas, the plesiosaurs were the stealth fighters. Their body plan is utterly unique in the history of the planet. There is nothing alive today that swims like them. They possess broad, flattened, almost turtle-like bodies, but they completely lacked a shell. And instead of using a muscular tail for propulsion, they relied on four massive wing-like flippers. They didn't swim in the traditional sense. They engaged in a synchronized underwater flight. This gave them incredible, almost unnatural maneuverability. They could hover in place, pivot on a dime, and strike with terrifying precision. Extending from that rigid, flying body was a neck so impossibly long and flexible, it looked like a serpent had been threaded to the torso of a seal. This neck was the ultimate ambush tool. A plesiosaur could keep its bulky, highly visible body hidden in the murky depths or concealed behind a jagged wall of coral reef, while its small head darted silently into schools of passing fish. By the time the prey even realized the predator was upon them, long, interlocking, needle-like teeth had already snapped shut, forming an inescapable biological cage. Yet, for all their blinding speed and stealth, neither the deep-diving ichthyosaurs nor the hovering plesiosaurs were safe, because the undisputed tyrants of the global ocean had arrived, the pliosaurs. These were plesiosaurs that had taken a drastic, horrifying evolutionary left turn. They traded the long, delicate, sweeping necks of their cousins for short, incredibly thick columns of pure muscle, supporting heads that were the size of small cars. These were the apex predators, the monsters that hunted the monsters. Animals like Liopleurodon and Pliosaurus reached lengths of 12 to 15 meters, weighing in excess of 10 tons. Their skulls were built like bank vaults, powered by jaw muscles that generated bite forces capable of crushing the shells of giant sea turtles and snapping the spines of other marine reptiles in half. Their teeth were the size of railroad spikes, deeply rooted and designed not for slicing, but for puncturing, holding, and dragging. If you were to dive into a Jurassic ocean, there was no sanctuary. Not in the warm, sunlit shallows where the plesiosaurs hovered. Not in the crushing, abyssal dark where the enormous eyes of Ophthalmosaurus searched. And certainly not in the open pelagic zones patrolled by the massive, cruising pliosaurs. It was an environment completely without cover. There were no burrows to hide in, no trees to climb, no dense underbrush to break a predator's line of sight. It was a fluid arena of pure, unadulterated, three-dimensional predation. But the ocean was only one frontier. To truly conquer the Earth, life had to defeat gravity itself. For hundreds of millions of years, the sky belonged exclusively to the insects. It was a silent, uncontested realm of giant dragonflies and primitive beetles. But the evolutionary pressure of the Mesozoic era was relentless, and the vertebrates finally, violently, pushed their way into the air, entered the pterosaurs. It is vital to understand that pterosaurs were not dinosaurs. They were a distinct, parallel lineage of reptiles that broke the bounds of the earth and mastered the wind long before the first bird ever sprouted a feather. And their method of flight was an absolute marvel of organic engineering, completely unlike anything alive today. A pterosaur wing was not made of feathers. It was a vast, living membrane of skin, muscle, and blood vessels, stretched drum-tight from the ankle all the way to the tip of an impossibly elongated fourth finger. But this was no simple, passive flap of leathery skin. Embedded deep within the wing membrane were thousands of microscopic, stiffened rods called actinofibrils. These structural fibers allowed the pterosaur to actively change the tension, shape, and camber of its wing in midair. They could fine-tune their aerodynamics with every single flap, achieving a level of flight control that modern human aeronautical engineers can only dream of. They were living, breathing, hypermaneuverable kites. To offset the massive, dragging weight of their bodies, their skeletons were hollowed out to an extreme degree. The bones of their wings were paper-thin tubes of calcium, filled entirely with internal air sacs connected to their respiratory system. A pterosaur with a wingspan of several meters might weigh less than a medium-sized dog. The skies of the Jurassic were populated by two distinct, highly specialized clans of these winged terrors. The first were the rhamphorhynchoids, the long-tailed aerial acrobats. Their tails trailed behind them like stiffened rods, tipped with a diamond-shaped vein of tissue that acted as a highly sensitive aerodynamic rudder. These were the coastal fishers. They skimmed the crashing waves, using their precision rudders to execute hairpin turns before snatching slippery fish from the surface, with jaws lined with forward-pointing teeth, slowly replacing them with the pterodactyloids, a group that made a massive evolutionary gamble. They shed the long tail entirely. To compensate for the loss of their stabilizing rudder, their brains physically expanded, taking on the massive computational load required to balance a tailless glider in turbulent, unpredictable air currents. But perhaps the most shocking truth about pterosaurs was not how they flew, but what covered their bodies. For decades, they were depicted as scaly, leathery, cold-blooded reptiles, but exceptional fossils, perfectly preserved in the fine-grained muds of ancient, stagnant lagoons, have revealed something completely different. Pterosaurs were covered in a dense, fuzzy coat of hair-like filaments called pycnofibers. This changes everything. It proves that pterosaurs were warm-blooded. generating the sheer, explosive kinetic energy required for powered flight burns an astronomical amount of calories. Their fuzzy coats trap the massive amounts of heat their flight muscles produced, allowing them to remain active, agile, and fiercely alert, even in the cool, high-altitude air or during the chill of the Jurassic night. And when a massive pterosaur wanted to take to the sky, it didn't just jump off a cliff and hope for the best. They didn't run on two legs and flap frantically like a bird. Biomechanical models suggest they use a staggering, highly explosive quadrupedal launch. They folded their massive wings into temporary, weight-bearing front legs, vaulted forward, and used the immense, spring-loaded power of their chest and shoulder muscles to catapult themselves into the air like biological pole vaulters. Within a fraction of a second, they snapped their wings open to catch the wind, achieving instant, flawless liftoff from completely flat ground. For millions of years, the pterosaurs owned the wind. They were the undisputed lords of the sky. But as the late Jurassic rolled on, deep in the humid, cycad-choked forests, a new challenger was quietly learning the laws of aerodynamics. A lineage of small, hypercarnivorous theropod dinosaurs had developed something highly peculiar, something that would eventually change the entire trajectory of life on Earth: feathers. At first, these feathers were nothing more than insulation. They were simple, downy coats designed to keep these active, warm-blooded little predators from freezing during the cool nights. But evolution is the ultimate opportunist. Feathers are incredibly light and highly structural. In the late 19th century, deep in a limestone quarry in Bavaria, Germany, workers splitting open slabs of rock found a ghost. It was a fossil so perfect, so impossibly detailed, that it sent shockwaves to the scientific world, fundamentally altering our understanding of biology. It was a creature that looked exactly like a small, vicious dinosaur. It had a mouth full of sharp teeth, a long, bony reptilian tail, and 3 clawed fingers on its hands. But extending from its arms and its tail were the unmistakable, perfectly preserved, microscopic impressions of fully developed flight feathers. They named it Archaeopteryx, the ancient wing. This was the ultimate transitional fossil. It was a creature frozen in the exact evolutionary moment between dinosaur and bird. The feathers on its arms were asymmetrical. The leading edge of the feather was narrower than the trailing edge. This is an aerodynamic signature that means only one thing. Archaeopteryx wasn't just a clumsy glider falling out of trees. It was capable of true, powered flight. It was an animal of two worlds. It could run swiftly along the forest floor, using its toothed jaws to snap up giant insects and small lizards, before using its clawed wings to scramble up the rough, resinous bark of a conifer tree. From there, it could launch itself into the canopy with frantic, powerful flaps, navigating the branches with its long, bony tail acting as a counterbalance. Archaeopteryx was primitive. It lacked the massive keel breastbone required to anchor the huge muscles needed for sustained, soaring flight. It couldn't migrate across oceans or ride the thermals like an eagle, but it was the vanguard. The dinosaurs had officially broken gravity's hold. The sky was no longer the exclusive, uncontested domain of the pterosaurs. The age of the birds had quietly, modestly begun, an evolutionary spark that would outlast the very dinosaurs it evolved from. Yet, while the giant dinosaurs achieved absolute supremacy over the continents, while marine reptiles bathed the oceans in blood, and while the pterosaurs and early birds fought a silent war for sky, there was a completely different world existing right beneath their feet. It was a world that existed in the literal and figurative shadows, largely unseen, entirely marginalized, and completely vital to the future of the planet. This was the world of the mammals. If you were to stand in a Jurassic forest during the peak of the day, you would see no mammals. They were completely absent from the sunlit hours. In a world dominated by hyper-efficient, massive, visually oriented reptilian predators, an animal the size of a rat walking out into the open in broad daylight was nothing more than a biological snack. To step into the sun was to invite instant death. So, the distant, furry ancestors of humanity retreated into the dark. They surrendered the day and became entirely nocturnal. To survive the pitch-black night, where the visual hunting skills of the dinosaurs were severely limited, the early mammals had to completely rewire their sensory systems. Deep within their skulls, a masterpiece of anatomical recycling was taking place. The bones that ancient reptiles used at the back of their lower jaws for eating began to shrink. Slowly, over millions of years, they detached from the jaw entirely and migrated upward into skull, eventually forming the malleus, incus, and stapes, the three tiny, delicate bones of the mammalian middle ear. This evolutionary shift gave Jurassic mammals a hearing range that was practically a superpower. They could hear high-frequency sounds that dinosaurs couldn't even register. They could hear the faintest scuff of a predator's claw on the dirt, the subtle crunch of a beetle shifting under a dead leaf, the breathing of a predator in the dark, coupled with massive expansion of the olfactory bulb in their brains. They lived in a world painted not in color and light, but in complex topographies of sound and scent. Long, highly sensitive whiskers extended from their snouts, allowing them to feel their way through the dark, sensing the microscopic changes in air pressure when a predator moved nearby. They were covered in dense, insulating fur, relying on a fiercely warm-blooded metabolism to hunt the cold, nighttime forest floors while the reptilian giants slept in the drop-in temperature. They were tiny, mostly the size of modern shrews, mice, and small badgers, sustaining themselves on a high-protein, high-energy diet of insects, grubs, and the occasional dinosaur egg. Their lives were brutal, brief, and frantic. They were forced to eat constantly just to keep their internal furnaces burning. They gave birth to tiny, underdeveloped, helpless young, hiding them deep in elaborate burrows carved between the massive, unyielding roots of towering ferns and cycads, nursing them with milk in the pitch black. To a casual observer, looking at the sheer scale and majesty of the Jurassic ecosystem, the mammals were evolutionary losers. They were pushed to the absolute fringes, restricted to the scraps of the ecosystem, living in constant, terrified hiding. But this forced marginalization was actually a biological crucible. By being forced to stay small, by being forced to perfect their warm-bloodedness, their acute hearing, their unparalleled sense of smell, and their rapidly expanding intelligence just to survive a single night, they were unknowingly building the ultimate survival toolkit. The traits they were forging in the dark of the Jurassic would one day be the exact tools needed to survive a global apocalypse. The mammals were playing the longest game in the history of the planet. They watched the mighty Allosaurus stalk the plains in the safety of their tunnels. They felt the earth tremble under the impossible weight of the sauropods and simply dug deeper. They hid as the pterosaurs eclipsed the moon. They survived by not competing, by staying hidden, by being endlessly patient. Every single one of these incredibly diverse animals, from the 50-ton titan stripping the canopy, to the stealthy plesiosaurs haunting the coastlines, down to the 20-gram nocturnal shrews shivering in the dirt, did not exist in a vacuum. They were bound together in massive, complex, unforgiving ecological webs, deeply tied to the shifting continents and the punishing weather patterns of the world they inhabited. But to truly understand how these ecosystems functioned, to see how the giants lived and how they died, we cannot just look at isolated bones or imagine their shadows. We have to look at the exact places where the earth swallowed them whole. We have to travel to the massive geological graveyards where the diaries of the Jurassic are written in stone, places where the mud preserved the final, agonizing moments of entire, breathing ecosystems. To truly comprehend a world that vanished 150 million years ago, you cannot just look at isolated, polished bones in a museum. You have to look at the graves. You have to read the diaries written in the bedrock itself, massive geological formations that froze the rhythm of life and death in a single, catastrophic instant. These are the places where the shadows of the deep past are dragged into the light, where we don't just see the animals, but the exact, brutal reality of how they died. If you were to stand in the western interior of North America during the late Jurassic, you would not see the snow-capped, jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. They simply did not exist yet. Instead, you would be standing in a vast, sprawling, relatively flat basin, a sweeping landscape carved by meandering river systems that drained slowly toward a shallow, inland sea. This was the environment that laid down the Morrison Formation. It is arguably the most spectacular, blood-soaked dinosaur graveyard ever discovered on the planet. The Morrison was a world ruled by punishing, unrelenting extremes. It was semi-arid, defined not by the constant, suffocating humidity of the tropics, but by a brutal cycle of wet and dry seasons. During the wet season, the rivers swelled and raged, spilling over their banks to create sprawling floodplains, vast temporary lakes, and lush, dense wetlands carpeted in giant ferns. It was an absolute paradise of excess. But when the dry season came, the landscape transformed into an oven. The sky turned a pale, dusty white. The rivers shrank to thick, sluggish trickles of brown mud. The temporary lakes evaporated, leaving behind vast plains of cracked, baked earth. This seasonal whiplash dictated the entire rhythm of life. As the water vanished, the animals were forced into desperate mass migrations, congregating in highly stressed herds around the few remaining permanent waterholes. Imagine the sheer, crushing tension in the air. Hundreds of giant sauropods, massive herds of Camarasaurus, the heavy, thundering Apatosaurus, and the impossibly long Diplodocus, crowding the muddy, shrinking banks. They stripped the surrounding gallery forest completely bare, consuming every needle and frond just to sustain their massive, boiling metabolisms. The noise would have been deafening, a cacophony of low-frequency rumbles, snapping trees, and the squelch of multi-ton feet sinking into the wet clay. And lurking in the baking tree line, drawn by the irresistible scent of desperation, heat, and decay, were the predators. The Morrison Formation has yielded a staggering, almost illogical number of Allosaurus skeletons. At one specific site in Utah, known as the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry, paleontologists have pulled the tangled, disarticulated remains of at least 46 individual Allosaurus from a single, highly concentrated pocket of rock. Why did so many apex predators die in one single, isolated place? The mud tells the story of a terrifying, self-perpetuating predator trap. As the dry season reached its absolute, blistering peak, water became the only currency that mattered. A giant herbivore, perhaps a young Camarasaurus or a sick, aging Stegosaurus, driven mad by thirst, ventured too far into the thick, sucking mud of a shrinking watering hole. Its massive feet broke through the drying crust, plunging deep into the wet, adhesive clay below. It tried to pull back, but the vacuum of the mud held it fast. It was hopelessly, permanently trapped. Its panicked, echoing bellows ripped across the dry plains. To an Allosaurus, this was the ultimate dinner bell. It was the promise of thousands of pounds of helpless meat. An Allosaurus would charge out the tree line, eyes locked entirely on the dying herbivore, rushing in to claim the easy meal. But in its frenzy, the predator wouldn't register the danger of the terrain. It would leap onto the back of the prey, tearing into the flesh, only to find its own feet sinking rapidly into the exact same inescapable mud. The predator became the prisoner. Then, drawn by the smell of fresh blood spilling into the hot air, another Allosaurus would arrive, and another, and another. It was a compounding, agonizing tragedy of starvation, exhaustion, and greed. A chaotic mass of thrashing, dying giants, predators and prey alike, sinking slowly into the earth under the baking sun, snapping at each other in their final, delirious moments. Some died of dehydration. Some were crushed by the arrival of even more predators. They died watching the vultures of the Jurassic skies circle patiently overhead, and they remained there, rotting in the baking mud, until the wet season finally returned, washing fresh, indifferent sediment over the massacre, burying their bones for 150 million years. But the brutal, muddy floodplains of the American West were only one piece of the global Jurassic puzzle. Half a world away, in what is now Bavaria, Germany, a completely different, almost delicate ecosystem was being perfectly preserved in the Solnhofen limestone. During the late Jurassic, Europe was not a continuous, solid continent. It was a tropical archipelago, a breathtaking scattering of lush, green islands surrounded by the warm, crystal-clear, shallow waters of the Tethys Sea. Among these islands lay a network of quiet, hypersaline lagoons, cut off from a turbulent open ocean by shifting white sandbars and razor-sharp coral reefs. These lagoons were deadly traps of their own, but not because of sticky mud or drought. They were silent, aquatic assassins. The water in these lagoons was intensely stratified. The surface water was warm, heavily oxygenated, and teeming with vibrant life. But the water at the bottom of the lagoon, shielded from the wind and currents, was completely anoxic, entirely, totally devoid of oxygen. It was a suffocating, toxic dead zone. If an animal died in the sunlit waters above and sank down into those stagnant, toxic depths, it was perfectly safe from the ravages of scavengers. Nothing could survive down there to eat it. No bottom feeders, no crabs, not even the bacteria that normally tear organic matter apart could function in the oxygen-starved sludge. And because the water was heavily saturated with calcium carbonate, a microscopic, endless rain of fine, powdery white sediment constantly fell through the water column to the lagoon floor. It acted like an incredibly slow, perfectly gentle snowfall, burying whatever lay on the bottom in a shroud of pure, fine-grained limestone. This unique chemical and geological process created what paleontologists call a Lagerstätte, a German word meaning storage place. But it didn't just store bones, it stored miracles. The Solnhofen limestone captured details that ordinary fossilization destroys in days. It preserved the delicate, gossamer wings of giant dragonflies, capturing every microscopic vein. It preserved the soft, muscular tentacles of ancient squid. It even recorded the exact, spidery trackways of horseshoe crabs. You can find slabs of rock showing the frantic, meandering footprints of a horseshoe crab that accidentally wandered into the anoxic dead zone, taking its final, suffocating steps across the lagoon floor before finally collapsing at the end of its own trail, immortalized forever. It preserved the intricately veined wing membranes of the pterosaur rhamphorhynchus, allowing us to see the exact aerodynamic shape of its flight surfaces, the diamond-shaped rudder on its tail, and even the last meal of fish still sitting undigested in its stomach. And, most famously, it was the suffocating, powdery mud of the Solnhofen that gently entombed the crushed, feathered body of Archaeopteryx, an early bird that perhaps misjudged a flight between islands, fell into the turquoise water, drowned, and drifted down into the toxic dark, its asymmetrical flight feathers captured with the fidelity of a high-resolution photograph. It is a breathtaking window into a delicate, tropical paradise, frozen with a level of detail that feels like magic. And yet, there is a third window, a place that bridges the massive terrestrial violence of the Morrison and the delicate marine wonders of the Solnhofen. Deep in the coastal estuaries of southeastern Tanzania, in Africa, lies a Tendigiri Formation. In the late Jurassic, this region of Africa was positioned much closer to the equator, blanketed in a hot, hyperhumid, oppressive tropical climate. The Tendigiri beds were formed in a dynamic, shifting environment where massive, slow-moving river systems dumped their heavy sediment into a shallow, relentlessly advancing sea. The result is a geological layer cake, where the fossils of the land and the fossils of the sea are intimately, chaotically mixed. The sea levels would rise, flooding the coastal forests, and then fall, allowing the dinosaurs to reclaim the beaches. It was from the deep tropical trenches of the Tendigiri that one of the most iconic, towering dinosaur skeletons in history was hauled out of the earth by expeditions in the early 20th century, Giraffatidan. This was a colossal, brachiosaur-like sauropod that reached lengths of 22 meters. But unlike the long, horizontal sauropods of North America, Giraffatidan was built vertically. Its massive front legs were significantly longer than its hind legs, angling its massive chest upward, supporting a neck that functioned like a biological siege tower. It was perfectly engineered to plunge its head into the absolute highest, most untouched canopies of the African conifer forests, stripping branches that no other herbivore on the continent could even dream of reaching. Walking in its towering shadow was Kentrosaurus, a smaller, highly aggressive African cousin of the Stegosaurus. But where the American Stegosaurus had wide, flat dorsal plates, Kentrosaurus traded them for an absolute thicket of lethal, backward-pointing bone spikes covering its shoulders, its lower back, and the entire length of its tail. It was a walking pincushion of biological armor, a testament to the diverse, terrifying predators that must have stalked the African estuaries. And washing up on those exact same ancient beaches, buried right alongside the colossal thigh bones of Giraffatidan and the spiked vertebrae of Kentrosaurus, were the remains of long-necked marine plesiosaurs. It is physical, irrefutable proof that the boundary between the terrestrial empire of the dinosaurs and the aquatic empire of the marine reptiles was a porous, ever-shifting line. Dinosaurs walked on the sand while sea monsters hunted in the surf just a few meters away. When you step back and look at the muddy death traps of the Morrison, the toxic, perfectly still lagoons of the Solnhofen, and the shifting, flooded coastlines of the Tendigiri all together, a magnificent, comprehensive picture of the late Jurassic emerges. This was the absolute zenith, the golden age. It was a period of unrestrained, global biological extravagance. Terrestrial diversity was at its absolute, undisputed peak. The Earth was operating in a state of breathtaking dynamic equilibrium. Niche partitioning, the brilliant evolutionary strategy of dividing up the ecosystem so that species don't directly, fatally compete for the same food, had reached a level of masterful, symphonic complexity. The short-necked sauropods vacuumed the low-growing understory. The medium-sized ornithopods chewed the tough shrubs. The vertical giants stripped the highest canopy. Small, feathered theropods darted to the brush, hunting insects and primitive mammals. Medium carnivores ambushed the sick and the young. Massive, apex killers hunted the plains, relying on ambush and raw strength. The air was flawlessly divided between the coastal skimming pterosaurs and the first fluttering, forest-dwelling birds. The oceans were layered perfectly with deep-diving ichthyosaurs, ambush-hunting plesiosaurs, and apex, bone-crushing pliosaurs. This staggering ecological redundancy made the late Jurassic ecosystems incredibly resilient. They were vast, interlocking, highly efficient machines of planetary energy transfer. They converted limitless, equatorial sunlight into limitless, towering vegetation. That vegetation was converted into millions of tons of living, breathing herbivore flesh, which in turn sustained a terrifying hierarchy of apex killers. It was a perfectly balanced world, a machine running at 100% efficiency across the entire globe. But every machine eventually breaks down, and every age, no matter how golden, no matter how perfectly balanced, must eventually end. Around 145 million years ago, the Jurassic Period began its slow, inevitable transition into the Cretaceous. Unlike the fiery volcanic apocalypse that birthed the dinosaurs at the end of the Triassic, this transition was not marked by violence. There was no sudden, blinding flash of a meteor. There were no seas of lava burying the continents. It was a quiet, creeping, insidious change. A slow shifting of the global stage that the dinosaurs could not fight because they could not see it happening. The boundary between the Jurassic and the Cretaceous is so incredibly subtle, so agonizingly gradual, that modern geologists still fiercely debate exactly where to draw the line in the rock. The supercontinent of Pangaea, which had begun tearing apart at the dawn of the Jurassic, was now irrevocably shattered. The Atlantic Ocean was widening every single day, pushing the continents further into their modern positions. This shifting of the massive land plates was fundamentally changing the global ocean currents. And when you change the ocean currents, you subtly, irreversibly alter the distribution of heat around the entire planet. The climates began to shift. The global hothouse began to experience slightly more pronounced temperature gradients. The world was still warm, but the flawless, uniform stability of the Jurassic was fracturing. In response, the perfectly balanced ecosystem began to slowly, quietly turn over. The magnificent Stegosaurs, those iconic, plated, spiked warriors of the Morrison fern prairies, began to mysteriously fade from the fossil record in North America. Their lineage, which had so successfully defended itself against the Allosaurus for millions of years, was slowly going extinct. Perhaps their preferred food sources were dying out. Perhaps the predators had finally figured out a way around their spiked tails. Whatever the cause, they were dying, making way for the heavy, low-slung, club-tailed ankylosaurs that would rise to replace them in the coming millions of years. The massive, whip-tailed diplodocids, the longest animals to ever walk the earth, began a steep decline in the northern hemisphere, though they clung to life in the southern continents. The Allosaurs, the butchers of the Golden Age, slowly gave way to newer, highly specialized killers, the early, feathered ancestors of the Tyrannosaurs. But these were just symptoms. The real killer of the Jurassic was not a predator, a volcano, or a shifting current. It was a botanical revolution, quietly brewing in the background, preparing to wage a silent war that would completely rewrite the rules of life on Earth. The endless, monotonous green of the gymnosperm forests, the towering conifers, the sharp cycads, and the dense ferns that had fueled the giant sauropods for 56 million years was about to be shattered. A new type of life was taking root in the early Cretaceous soil, a genetic mutation that would bring explosive color, incredible speed, and an entirely new, hyper-aggressive method of reproduction to the planet. The very first flowers were about to bloom, and when they did, the world would never be the same again. To a human mind, the blossoming of flowers is a symbol of peace, of delicate beauty. But in the ruthless, hyper-competitive arena of deep time, the arrival of the angiosperms, the flowering plants, was an act of biological blitzkrieg. It was a botanical revolution so fast, so aggressive, and so overwhelmingly successful that Charles Darwin himself famously referred to it as an abominable mystery. For 56 million years, the Jurassic had been ruled by the slow, steady growth of the gymnosperms. Conifers, cycads, and ferns took their time. They grew massive. They invested heavily in toxic, unyielding, fibrous leaves, and they relied on the blind, chaotic wind to carry their pollen across the continents. It was an inefficient system, but it worked in a world dominated by massive, slow-fermenting sauropods that stripped the forest bare. But the flowering plants hacked the system. They completely rewrote the rules of reproduction. Instead of relying on the wind, they enlisted mercenaries. By evolving bright, visually arresting petals and producing rich, high-energy nectar, the first flowers actively manipulated the behavior of animals. They weaponized the insect world. A beetle or a primitive wasp would land on a flower to drink the nectar, inadvertently covering itself in pollen, and then fly directly to another flower of the same species. It was a targeted, laser-precise delivery system. Because of this unparalleled efficiency, angiosperms didn't need to live for hundreds of years or grow into towering trees to reproduce. They could grow, bloom, seed, and die in a matter of months. They were fast. They were adaptable. They were weed-like in their aggressive colonization of the bare earth. And as the flowers spread, the soundscape of the planet fundamentally changed. The silent, wind-swept gymnosperm forests of the Jurassic began to buzz. The evolution of flowers triggered a massive coevolutionary explosion in the insect world. The very first ancestors of bees and butterflies took to the air, their bodies perfectly, intricately modified to harvest nectar and carry pollen. The air was no longer just a medium for pterosaurs to glide through. It became a humming, vibrating superhighway of biological commerce. This hyperfast, low-growing carpet of flowering plants spelled the beginning of the end for the classic Jurassic ecosystems. The towering, slow-growing cycads simply could not compete with the explosive growth rates of the angiosperms. And as the plant life changed, the animals that relied on them were forced into a brutal ultimatum: adapt or die. The ornithopods, the swift, bipedal herbivores like Camptosaurus that had spent the Jurassic hiding in massive herds, looked at this new, fast-growing food source and thrived. They already possessed the primitive beginnings of a beak and grinding teeth. As the Cretaceous period progressed, these animals would evolve into the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs. Their skulls would become mechanical masterpieces, packed with dental batteries consisting of thousands of tightly interlocking teeth, capable of chewing and pulverizing the toughest new plant material with an efficiency that rivaled modern horses. But for the iconic giant of the Jurassic, the transition was far less forgiving. The massive, whip-tailed diplodocids, the longest animals to ever walk the planet, found their world vanishing. Their bodies were perfectly engineered to strip soft, high-canopy gymnosperms and rake vast fields of ferns. As the forests changed and the continents drifted, the ecosystems that supported their specific, extreme gigantism collapsed in the northern hemisphere. Their bones vanished from the rock record of North America and Europe. The Stegosaurs, with their magnificent dorsal plates and lethal thagomizers, faced a similar fate. The low-growing vegetation they relied on was being outcompeted. As their populations dwindled, a new lineage of armored dinosaurs stepped out of shadows to claim the vacant throne, the Ankylosaurs. Where the Stegosaurus had plates, the Ankylosaurus had a continuous, fused shell of solid bone covering its entire back, its eyelids armored, its tail ending in a massive, heavy club of bone capable of shattering the shins of the most terrifying predators. The armor of the Jurassic was defensive. The armor of the Cretaceous was built for absolute, crushing warfare. And the predators were changing, too. For millions of years, the Allosaurs have been the undisputed butchers of the floodplains, using their hatchet jaws to bleed out giant sauropods. Their direct descendants, the Dinosaurs, would continue this legacy for a time, growing to massive proportions in the southern hemisphere, hunting the last of the giant titanosaurs. But in the northern hemisphere, the shifting, flowering landscape favored a different kind of killer. Deep in the underbrush of the late Jurassic, there had been small, marginalized, feathered predators. They were no bigger than dogs, completely overshadowed by the massive Allosaurus. They were the early Tyrannosaurs. For tens of millions of years, they had waited. They had survived by being smart, by being fast, and by developing a completely different method of killing. While the Allosaurs relied on slicing teeth and blood loss, the Tyrannosaurs invested everything in pure, concussive bite force. As the Jurassic gave way to Cretaceous, and the Allosaurs faded from the northern continents, these small, feathered hunters stepped into the apex role. Over millions of years, they would grow. Their skulls would widen into massive, fused anvils of bone. Their teeth would thicken into railroad spikes designed not to slice flesh, but to shatter solid bone and extract the nutrient-rich marrow inside. The delicate, slicing precision of the Jurassic predators was replaced by the overwhelming, bone-crushing brutality of the tyrant kings. Even the skies were unrecognizable. The pterosaurs, those magnificent, leathery-winged masters of the Jurassic thermals, suddenly found themselves in a desperate war for the air. The descendants of Archaeopteryx, the small, feathered, toothed birds of the Solnhofen lagoons, were evolving at a blistering pace. They shed their heavy, bony, reptilian tails, fusing the vertebrae into a short stub called a pygostyle. Their collarbones fused into a highly elastic wishbone, acting like a biological spring to store and release kinetic energy with every single flap of their wings. Their chest bones expanded into massive, keeled sternums, anchoring enormous flight muscles. They became true, sustained flyers. They were faster, more agile, and more adaptable than the smaller pterosaurs. Unable to compete with the sheer aerodynamic perfection of the birds, the smaller pterosaurs went entirely extinct. To survive, the remaining pterosaur lineages did the only thing they could. They grew. They abandoned the small prey niches to birds and evolved into absolute titans. The pterosaurs of Cretaceous would become the largest animals to ever take the sky, their wingspan stretching 10, 11, 12 meters across, the size of small fighter jets, casting massive, sweeping shadows over the blooming, flowering earth below, and in the oceans, the fluid arena of the marine reptiles. The great turnover was equally ruthless. The ichthyosaurs, the deep-diving, dolphin-like torpedoes of the Jurassic, began to struggle. The changing ocean currents, driven by the widening Atlantic, altered the distribution of the squid and fish they relied on. Slowly, inevitably, they faded into extinction, their perfectly streamlined bodies disappearing from the oceans forever. The long-necked plesiosaurs held on, hunting in the shallow coastal shelves, but a new, terrifying shadow was gliding into the water from the land. The mosasaurs. They were not dinosaurs. They were massive, highly aggressive marine lizards, closely related to modern monitor lizards and snakes. They slithered off the coastlines and into water, their bodies elongating, their jaws lined with double rows of recurved teeth. They did not fly underwater like the plesiosaurs. They swam with a terrifying, serpentine undulation of giant crocodiles, eventually growing to lengths of 15 meters, becoming the undisputed, terrifying apex predators of the Cretaceous seas. The Jurassic was not a failure, because it ended. To view the extinction of the Stegosaurs or the Allosaurs as a defeat is to fundamentally misunderstand the magnificent, brutal mechanics of deep time. The Jurassic Period was the ultimate evolutionary incubator. It was a testing ground. It was a 56 million year crucible where the blueprints of terrestrial dominance were drawn in blood, bone, and stone. The animals of the Cretaceous, the Tyrannosaurs, the Triceratops, the Ankylosaurs, were not magical new creations. They were the highly modified, heavily refined descendants of survivors that clawed their way out of the Jurassic ecosystems. And through all of this turnover, through the rise of the flowers, the shifting of the continents, and the rise of the bone-crushing tyrants, the mammals remained exactly where they had been. They were still in the dark. They were still small. They were still covered in fur. But deep within their genetic code, in the safety of their subterranean burrows, the final, crucial modifications were being made. The ancient, egg-laying mammals were splitting into two distinct, revolutionary lineages. One group evolved to pouch, giving birth to tiny embryos that crawled blindly to milk, the marsupials. The other group evolved a miraculous, temporary organ that allowed a mother to safely exchange oxygen and nutrients directly with her unborn young, keeping the baby protected inside her body until it was fully developed. The placenta, it was an invisible, internal revolution that would one day conquer the Earth. But not yet. For now, the Cretaceous period was in full, glorious swing. The Earth was a vibrant, blooming, highly aggressive world ruled by the ultimate iterations of dinosaurian perfection. It was an empire that seemed entirely invincible. They had survived volcanic apocalypses, the splitting of continents, and the complete botanical rewriting of the planet's surface. They were the masters of the land, the air, and the sea. But the universe is infinitely larger than the Earth. And the ultimate test of the Jurassic's legacy was not going to come from a changing climate or a new predator or a blooming flower. It was coming from the cold, soundless void of deep space. A 6-mile-wide piece of rock, moving at 45,000 miles per hour, locked on a dead, inescapable collision course with the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago. It was a completely ordinary day at the end of the Cretaceous period. The sun beat down on the sprawling, vibrant ecosystems of North America. Giant herds of horned triceratops moved slowly through the lush, flowering underbrush. Massive, crested hadrosaurs called each other across the floodplains, their voices echoing through the thick, humid air. Deep in the tree line, a Tyrannosaurus rex rested in the shade, digesting a massive kill, completely undisputed in its absolute supremacy. Above them, colossal pterosaurs rode the warm thermal currents, their 12-meter wingspans casting fleeting shadows over shallow, teeming seas where mosasaurs aggressively patrolled the coral reefs. It was an empire that had been built upon the blueprints forged in the Jurassic. It was a world that had endured shifting continents, changing climates, and the ruthless, endless arms race of evolution. The dinosaurs were not a dying lineage. They were at the absolute peak of their biological success, more diverse and specialized than at any point in their 160 million-year reign. They were perfectly adapted to their world. But they were not adapted to a rock the size of Mount Everest falling from the sky. When the asteroid pierced the upper atmosphere, it was moving at roughly 20 kilometers per second. It was moving so unimaginably fast that the air in front of it didn't have time to push out of the way. Instead, the atmosphere was violently compressed, superheating into a plasma brighter than 1,000 suns. For the animals grazing on the North American continent, there was no warning. There was only a sudden, blinding flash of light that instantly seared the retinas of anything looking at the sky. A fraction of a second later, the asteroid slammed into the shallow, carbonate-rich waters of what is now the Gulf of Mexico. The physics of the impact defy human comprehension. The asteroid did not simply hit the ground and stop. It drove itself miles deep into the Earth's crust in a fraction of a heartbeat, instantly vaporizing the ocean, the bedrock, and itself. The kinetic energy released was equivalent to billions of atomic bombs detonating simultaneously. A crater 100 miles wide was punched into the planet. The ocean was blown backward, exposing the bare, smoking mantle of the Earth for a split second before the water rushed back in, generating a colossal tsunami hundreds of meters high that raced outward, scouring the coastlines of the Americas down to the bedrock. The ground shook with a seismic violence that the Earth had not felt since its turbulent infancy. Earthquakes registering a magnitude 11 or 12 rang the planet like a bell, triggering massive landslides and volcanic eruptions thousands of miles away. But the tsunamis and the earthquakes were only the local executioners. The true global apocalypse was happening directly above. When the asteroid vaporized the Yucatan Peninsula, it blasted billions of tons of pulverized, superheated rock glass and sulfur straight up to the atmosphere and out into the freezing vacuum of space. The debris expanded outward, enveloping the globe in a massive, expanding suborbital cloud. But what goes up must come down. Minutes after the impact, the ejecta began to fall back to Earth. Trillions of microscopic beads of molten glass and rock re-entered the atmosphere. As they fell, the friction of their re-entry generated heat. A single falling glass bead generates a minuscule amount of thermal radiation, but trillions of them, falling across the entire surface of the planet simultaneously, turned the upper atmosphere into a global broiler oven. The sky turned a terrifying, glowing red. The temperature at the surface of the Earth spiked to hundreds of degrees within minutes. Any animal caught out in the open, The magnificent Triceratops, the stalking Tyrannosaurs, the massive, soaring pterosaurs, was instantly mercilessly roasted alive. The heat pulse ignited the world's forests. From the Americas to Asia, the global canopy burst into spontaneous, uncontrollable continental wildfires. The smoke in the burning world rose up, mixing with the massive plumes of vaporized sulfur and soot injected into the stratosphere by the impact itself. And then the red sky went completely, terrifyingly black. The debris, the soot, and the sulfur aerosols formed an impenetrable, suffocating blanket around the planet. The sun was entirely blocked out. This was not a temporary eclipse. This was an impact winter, a suffocating darkness that would last for months, perhaps years. Without sunlight, the great engine of the planet ground to a violent halt. Photosynthesis stopped. The massive, flowering plants and the ancient gymnosperms withered and died in the freezing dark. The global food web, so intricately balanced, so perfectly tuned over tens of millions of years, collapsed from the bottom up. The herbivorous dinosaurs that survived the initial heat pulse and the wildfires suddenly found themselves in a freezing, blackened wasteland with absolutely nothing to eat. Their massive metabolisms, which require hundreds of pounds of vegetation a day, became their death sentences. They starved in the dark, their massive bodies collapsing into the ash. And as the plant eaters died, the apex predators were doomed. A Tyrannosaurus rex could scavenge the rotting carcasses for a few weeks, perhaps a few months, but eventually the meat ran out. The ultimate killing machines, the heirs of the terrifying legacy of Allosaurus, were reduced to shivering, starving scavengers, slowly succumbing to the freezing, toxic air until the last giant collapsed, exhaled a final breath into the dark, and died. The ocean suffered the exact same cascading failure. The darkness killed the marine phytoplankton, the microscopic plants that formed the absolute base of the oceanic food web. Without the plankton, the krill and small fish died. Without the small fish, the ancient coiled ammonites died. And without the ammonites and fish, the apex killers of the sea, the massive serpentine mosasaurs and the last of the long-necked plesiosaurs, starved in the murky, acidified depths. The pterosaurs, the lords of sky that had mastered the wind during the Jurassic, fell from the air. Their massive, specialized bodies were entirely reliant on finding meat and fish over vast, soaring distances. In a world without thermals to ride, in a world without food to hunt, their wings were useless. They died on the ground, ending a 160-million-year dynasty of flight. The gigantism that had been the ultimate biological hack of the Jurassic, the evolutionary strategy that said grow large enough and nothing can kill you, had been completely, brutally inverted. In the post-impact world, size was a fatal liability. You could not hide 10 tons of meat. You cannot fuel a multi-ton metabolism in a world without the sun. The giants were marked for death the moment the asteroid struck. But extinction, as the Earth learned during the fiery end of the Triassic, is never absolute. Life is a tenacious, stubborn, impossibly resilient thing. As the colossal dinosaurs died on the blackened, freezing surface, the ultimate evolutionary payout was being collected deep in the dirt and deep in the shadows. The traits that had been forged in the cruel, marginalized crucible of the Jurassic were suddenly the only things keeping life tethered to the planet. Who survived the end of the world? The animals that could hide, the animals that could wait, the animals that didn't need the sun. Deep beneath the burning forest, safe from the thermal pulse and insulated from a freezing impact winter, the mammals were exactly where they had always been, in the dark. For 56 million years during the Jurassic, and for another 80 million years during the Cretaceous, they had been brutally forced to remain small, nocturnal burrowers. They had never been allowed to grow large. They had never been allowed to dominate. But because they were small, their caloric needs were a fraction of dinosaurs. Because they were burrowers, they were shielded from the fiery rain of glass and the suffocating cold of the long night. Because they were warm-blooded and covered in fur, adaptations perfected during the cool Jurassic nights. They could regulate their own body temperatures when the sun vanished. And, most importantly, they were not picky eaters. They were generalists. They didn't eat fresh leaves or massive slabs of meat. They could eat the rotting, decaying matter that carpeted the dead world. They ate the insects that fed on the carcasses of the giant dinosaurs. They ate roots, fungi, and the seeds buried in the soil. They scavenged the ruins of the empire that had oppressed them for over 100 million years. And they were not the only survivors. Up in the blackened, dead branches of the burnt forest, a very specific, highly specialized lineage of dinosaurs was also clinging to life. The giant, terrifying theropods were dead, but their tiny feathered cousins, the descendants of the early birds that fluttered through the Solnhofen lagoons, had an incredible evolutionary advantage. Unlike the pterosaurs, these true birds were small. They didn't need massive amounts of food. And crucially, some of these early birds had evolved specialized, toothless beaks designed to crack open and eat seeds. This was the ultimate biological lottery ticket. When the plants died, they left behind trillions of seeds buried in the dirt. A seed is essentially a tiny, armored, dormant time capsule of high-density calories. While the leaves withered and the meat rotted, the seeds remained perfectly intact in the soil, waiting for the sun. The small, ground-dwelling, seed-eating birds pecked their way through the apocalypse, sustaining their fast metabolisms on the concentrated energy packets left behind by the dead forests. In the rivers and swamps, the animals with slow, cold-blooded metabolisms simply shut down. Crocodiles, the distant, aquatic cousins of the ancient pseudosuchians, buried themselves in the mud, lowered their heart rates to a few beats a minute, and entered a state of suspended animation, waiting out the freezing darkness for months on end. Turtles did the same. They simply stopped living actively, holding their breath and waiting for the world to heal. For years, the earth was a silent, rotting, freezing graveyard. The only sound was the howling of the ash-choked wind, the rushing of the acidified waves, and the quiet, frantic scratching of tiny mammalian claws digging through the soot in search of meal. But eventually, the atmosphere began to clear. The heavy aerosols washed out of the sky in dark, toxic rains. The soot settled, and one morning, for the first time in perhaps a decade, a pale, weak ray of sunlight pierced the gloom and touched the surface of the earth. It illuminated a world that had been completely, violently reset. The non-avian dinosaurs, the terrible, magnificent kings of the Mesozoic, were gone. Their colossal skeletons, the bones of the tyrannosaurs, the triceratops, and the massive titanosaurs, lay scattered across the continents, slowly sinking into the mud to begin their 100-million-year journey into fossilization. The pterosaurs were gone. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs were gone. The ammonites were gone. 75% of all species on the planet had been erased. As the sunlight warmed the soil, the first green shoots pushed their way up to the thick layer of iridium-laced ash. They were ferns. Just as they had after the volcanic apocalypse of the Triassic, the hardy, opportunistic ferns were the first to colonize the devastated landscape, creating a sudden, global fern spike in the fossil record. Slowly, the surviving seeds of the flowering plants and the ancient gymnosperms began to sprout. The forest began to return, no longer choked with ash, but breathing in the clear, sunlit air. The planet was healing, and as the world warmed, as the green returned to the continents, a tiny, furry creature poked its whiskered snout out of a burrow. It sniffed the air, its highly advanced olfactory bulb, perfected in the shadows of Jurassic, processing the scent of damp earth and fresh vegetation. It blinked in the bright, unfamiliar light of the daytime sun. For the first time in 160 million years, it did not have to look over its shoulder for the shadow of a theropod. It did not have to scurry back into the dark to avoid being crushed by a sauropod. The monsters were gone. The masters of the world were dead. The age of the reptiles was violently, permanently over. The inheritance of the earth had fallen to the meek. The mammals finally, cautiously, stepped out of the dirt and into the light of a new, totally empty world. But the ghosts of the Jurassic, the deep, invisible architecture of the ecosystems that the dinosaurs had built, and the evolutionary marvels they left behind, would echo through the bloodlines of every single creature that was about to inherit the future. The earth did not belong to the giants anymore. It belonged to the opportunists. As the ash settled and the impact winter slowly released its freezing grip on the globe, the tiny, shivering survivors crawled out of their subterranean bunkers and looked out over a completely alien landscape. For over 160 million years, a mammalian life form had never been allowed to grow larger than a small badger. The ecological ceiling had been made of solid, impenetrable dinosaur bone. Every single niche for a large herbivore, a medium browser, or a terrestrial apex predator had been fiercely occupied by the most perfectly adapted reptiles the universe had ever produced. But now, the ceiling was gone. The stage was breathtakingly, entirely empty. What followed was one of the most explosive, violent, and rapid evolutionary radiations in the history of the planet. It was a biological land grab on a global scale. Without the terrifying shadows of the theropods to keep them suppressed, the mammals began to grow. And as they grew, the genetic traits that had been brutally forged in the dark, terrifying nights of Jurassic suddenly became the ultimate tools for daytime domination. Remember the teeth of the giant sauropods? They were simple pegs, designed only to rake leaves and swallow them whole, relying on massive stomachs and swallowed stones to do the work of digestion. But the mammals had spent 56 million years in the Jurassic undergrowth eating a highly varied diet of tough insects, seeds, and scraps. To extract enough energy to fuel their warm-blooded, fast-beating hearts, they had evolved complex, specialized teeth. They had incisors for cutting, canines for piercing, and highly intricate molars for grinding. They were the first animals to truly master the act of chewing. This simple evolutionary trick meant a mammal could process its food mechanically in its mouth before it ever hit the stomach, extracting a massive amount of calories with incredible speed. Armed with these highly specialized teeth, the mammals rapidly diversified. Some lineages evolved flat, massive molars and became the new, grazing herbivores, feeding on the rapidly spreading carpets of flowering plants and the newly evolved grasses. Other lineages lengthened their canines, grew razor-sharp carnassial teeth, and became the new apex predators, hunting the mammal herbivores across the very same plains where Allosaurus once stalked. And they had another secret weapon, perfected deep in the Cretaceous shadows, the placenta. While the dinosaurs laid eggs, leaving their developing young vulnerable to the elements, to nest raiders, and to sudden temperature drops, the placental mammals kept their young locked safely inside the mother's body. The mother acted as a walking, heavily defended, warm-blooded incubator. She could carry her unborn young away from predators, migrate to find food, and guarantee a stable internal temperature for her offspring until they were highly developed and ready to be born. Fueled by complex teeth, a high-octane metabolism, and this revolutionary reproductive strategy, the mammals swelled in size. Within a few million years of the asteroid impact, there were mammals the size of pigs, then the size of cows, eventually the size of rhinoceroses and elephants. They claimed the forests, the plains, and the mountains. But the most spectacular triumph of the mammalian lineage, the ultimate full-circle moment of convergent evolution, happened at the edge of the water. In the early Cenozoic era, a lineage of hoofed, wolf-like mammals hunting along the shallow coastlines realized that the oceans were entirely empty. The magnificent serpentine mosasaurs were dead. The long-necked plesiosaurs were gone. The waters were teeming with fish, but there were no apex predators left to hunt them. So, the mammals waded into the surf. Over millions of years, they committed to the water. Their front legs flattened and widened into rigid steering flippers. Their hind legs shrank, fused, and eventually disappeared entirely into their torsos. Their tails thickened, developing massive, horizontal flukes of pure muscle. They lost their fur to reduce aquatic drag, trading it for thick, insulating layers of blubber to survive the freezing ocean depths. They became the whales and the dolphins. If you look at the skeleton of a modern dolphin and compare it to the skeleton of a Jurassic ichthyosaur, the physical resemblance is absolutely staggering. They are separated by over 100 million years of evolution. One is a warm-blooded mammal that descended from tiny nocturnal insect eaters. The other was a cold-blooded reptile that adapted to the sea. Yet, the brutal, unforgiving laws of fluid dynamics sculpted them into the exact same shape. The ghost of the ichthyosaur lives on, hunting in the very same oceans, reborn in a mammalian body. But it would be a massive, tragic mistake to look at the modern world and assume that the dinosaurs simply failed. To say that dinosaurs went extinct is an incomplete truth. The non-avian dinosaurs, the massive Triceratops, the towering Brachiosaurus, the heavy-plated Stegosaurus, were annihilated, but the lineage itself did not die. It merely shed its heavy, terrestrial weight and took entirely to the air. Look outside your window. The birds you see resting on the telephone wires, hopping through grass, or riding the high thermals are not just relatives of the dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. They are the direct, unbroken genetic descendants of the small, feathered, hypercarnivorous theropods that stalked the fern prairies of the Jurassic. When you watch a hawk dive from the sky to strike a mouse, you are watching the exact same predatory biomechanics, the exact same bipedal balance, and the exact same vicious, grasping talons that made Allosaurus the nightmare of the Morrison Formation. When you listen to the complex, melodic song of a mockingbird, you are hearing the highly evolved vocalizations of an ancient reptilian lineage that survived the apocalypse. The dinosaurs never lost their biological marvels. That incredible, highly efficient one-way respiratory system, the rigid lungs and hollow air sacs that allowed a 50-ton sauropod to breathe effortlessly while supporting a 10-meter neck, is the exact same respiratory system that allows a modern bar-headed goose to fly directly over freezing, oxygen-starved peaks of the Himalayas without suffocating. The pneumatic, hollow bones that kept the giant theropods light on their feet are the exact same hollow bones that allow an albatross to glide over the open ocean for thousands of miles without a single flap of its wings. The age of reptiles didn't end. It just grew feathers, shrank in size, and became the most diverse group of terrestrial vertebrates on the planet. Today, there are roughly 10,000 species of birds. They outnumber mammal species by almost 2 to 1. In a very real biological sense, we are still living in the age of the dinosaurs, but the world they inhabit today is completely unrecognizable from the one their ancestors ruled. The Earth is not a static rock. It is a massive, shifting, dynamic engine of heat and pressure. The great supercontinent of Pangaea, which began to violently tear itself apart in the fiery dawn of the Jurassic, continued its slow, agonizing, tectonic drift throughout the millions of years that followed. The Atlantic Ocean, which began as a shallow, flooded rift valley, widened into a vast, dark, turbulent expanse, pushing the Americas far away from Europe and Africa. The southern landmass of Gondwana splintered into pieces. Antarctica drifted southward, eventually locking itself over the South Pole, freezing into a desolate, ice-covered wasteland, fundamentally altering global ocean currents and plunging the Earth into a much cooler, more volatile climate. India, which broke away from Madagascar as a massive, isolated island, raced northward across the ocean at astonishing geological speeds. When it finally slammed into the underbelly of the Asian continent, the sheer, unimaginable kinetic force of the impact crumpled the Earth's crust, thrusting the seabed high into the freezing air, creating the jagged, towering peaks of the Himalayan mountain range. The planet transformed from a uniform, humid greenhouse into a world of fractured continents, freezing ice caps, vast grassy plains, and highly defined climate zones. And as the continents drifted and the climates cooled, the remains of the Jurassic world were buried. The muddy floodplains of the Morrison Formation were covered by thousands of feet of newer rock, waiting in the dark until the tectonic uplift of the North American plate pushed them back toward the surface, exposing them to the wind and rain of the modern American West. The toxic and noxic lagoons of Solnhofen were compressed into pristine, fine-grained limestone, buried deep beneath the rolling green hills of modern-day Bavaria. The flooded coastal estuaries of the Tendaguru were locked into the rock of southeastern Africa. The physical world of the Jurassic was swallowed by the earth, but its legacy is not just buried in the stone. It is buried in you. Hold up your hand and look at it. Flex your fingers. Feel the pulse beating steadily in your wrist. You are a biological masterpiece, the result of billions of years of unbroken, relentless survival. But your specific mammalian architecture, the very things that make you human, were forged in the terrifying crucible of the Jurassic night. Those 3 tiny, delicate bones in your middle ear, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, the bones are allowing you to hear the sound of this voice right now, were once the jawbones of an ancient reptile. They shrank and migrated into your skull, so that your tiny, shivering ancestors could hear the heavy, crushing footfalls of theropods stalking through the dark. Your warm blood, the internal furnace that keeps your body at a constant, stable temperature regardless of the weather outside, was perfected by small, furry creatures that had survived the freezing, sunless hours while the cold-blooded giants slept. Your brain, with its massive, highly folded neocortex, the part of your mind that allows you to process complex language, build towering cities, split the atom, and contemplate the very nature of deep time, began its evolutionary expansion not for a high-level philosophy, but simply to process the overwhelming flood of olfactory and auditory data needed to hunt beetles in the pitch black of a cycad forest. You are the product of the marginalized. You are the descendant of the terrified, the small, and the hidden. We inherited the earth not because we were the strongest or the largest or the most terrifying creatures to ever walk it. We inherited the earth because our ancestors learned how to endure. The Jurassic Period spanned 56 million years. It is a duration of time so vast, so completely outside the scale of human comprehension, that it is almost impossible to truly visualize. If you were to compress the entire 4.5 billion year history of the Earth into a single 24-hour day, the Jurassic Period would last for exactly 18 minutes. It would happen somewhere in the late evening. By comparison, the entirety of human existence, from the moment the first early hominids stood upright on the African savanna, through the discovery of fire, the building of the pyramids, the Industrial Revolution, and the landing on the moon, would take place in the absolute final fraction of the very last second before midnight. We are a brilliant, loud, incredibly destructive flash in the pan. We have existed for a geological millisecond, but in that millisecond, we have developed something that no other creature in the history of the planet has ever possessed. We have developed the ability to look backward. A Brachiosaurus, for all its towering, magnificent biological glory, had no concept of the animals that came before it. It did not know that the ground it walked on was built over the ashes of the Triassic extinction. It did not know that the asteroid was coming. It simply lived, consumed, reproduced, and died in an endless, unthinking cycle of biological imperative. But we can dig into the dirt. We can pull the crushed, fossilized bones out of the bedrock and piece them back together. We can analyze the chemical isotopes in ancient, petrified wood to determine the exact temperature of the atmosphere 150 million years ago. We can look at the microscopic, asymmetrical structure of a fossilized feather and deduce the exact biomechanics of the first flight. We are the universe's way of understanding itself. Through our science, our curiosity, and our relentless desire to know where we came from, we have resurrected the Jurassic. We have breathed life back into the Titans. We have mapped the deep, forgotten oceans, and we have traced the lineage of the birds in the sky and the bones in our own ears back to a world that was ruled by giants. The past is not truly past. It is completely interwoven with the present. The carbon atoms that make up your DNA have cycled through the biosphere millions of times. You might contain an atom that was once part of the massive, beating heart of a diplodocus. You might hold carbon that was breathed out by an Allosaurus, or incorporated into the wing membrane of a soaring pterosaur. Matter is never destroyed. It is only transformed, moving through an endless, majestic cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The Jurassic was not just an era of monsters. It was a perfectly functional, deeply interconnected world. It was a time when life pushed the physical limits of what is possible, testing the boundaries of gigantism, armor, flight, and sensory adaptation. It proved that ecosystems can support unimaginable diversity, that life will always find a way to exploit every available niche, and that even in the face of the most catastrophic, world-ending violence, something will always survive in the ashes. Tomorrow, the sun will rise. The continents will drift a few millimeters further apart. The birds will sing from the trees, carrying the genetic echoes of the dinosaurs in their throats. And you will walk out into a world that was shaped fundamentally and permanently by the 56 million years of the Jurassic. You are a time traveler. You carry the deep history of the planet in your bones, in your blood, and in your breath. You are the surviving legacy of the longest, most brutal, and most magnificent evolutionary war ever fought. Thank you for taking this incredible journey through deep time with us. The story of our planet is the greatest, most terrifying, and most beautiful story ever told, and we have only just scratched the surface. If you want to continue exploring the lost empires of life, the ancient catastrophes that shaped our world, and the breathtaking scale of geological history, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below letting us know which ancient era we should travel to next. Until then, look up at the birds, look down at the earth, and never stop wondering about the worlds beneath your feet. This is Earth Documentary. Stay curious, and we will see you in the next era.